Welcome, everyone, both in person and online. I'm Susan Yaki, the director of the Follette School. And I'm delighted that you could join us for tonight's conversation with FiveThirtyEight founder, Nate Silver. Before moving forward, I wanted to take a moment to tell you about the Follette School. The Follette School is the public policy school in the state of Wisconsin, and it's one of the top policy schools in the world. We educate graduate students in our master's programs, as well as UW-Madison undergraduate students in our Certificate in Public Policy program and in our brand new Certificate in Health Policy program. Right now, the school is experiencing tremendous growth, doubling the size of our faculty and tripling the number of students that we serve, all within the last several years. Part of this growth has been funded by a $10 million investment in the school by former U.S. Senator Herb Kohl, and we are so thankful for that gift. That generous investment has changed the trajectory of the Follette School, and it enables us to convene events like tonight where we can contribute to thoughtful and informed dialogue around today's public policy issues. This fall, the Follette School faculty have fully embraced the Wisconsin idea aspect of our mission, and they are traveling around the state to talk with voters about the issues that they care about. The initiative is called the Main Street Agenda Project, and it is in partnership with the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel and Wisconsin Public Radio. Hundreds and hundreds of Wisconsinites have turned out, both in person and online, for our events in Pewaukee, Milwaukee, and in Green Bay, and we're going to wrap up the series next week in Wausau. There's a clear hunger to engage. I think that's why you're all here, too. And we've consistently heard from Wisconsinites how appreciative they are to have robust and civil conversations on public policy topics. These town halls are just one example of how La Follette is bringing people together to focus attention on our public policy challenges. And I want to do a quick shout out to our board member, David Lubar, and his wife, Madeline, for their generous support of those town halls. But let me shift gears to why we're all here tonight. Chuck Pruitt, a member of our La Follette School Board of Visitors, is here to introduce tonight's speaker. So let me close by introducing you to Chuck. Chuck is the co-managing director of AB Data, where he has a front seat view for all things Wisconsin polling and elections, and he's had that for decades. Chuck has strong ties to higher ed and to UW-Madison, starting his career as a professor at St. Olaf College and serving the university for 13 years on the University of Wisconsin's Board of Regents, including 4 years as vice president and president of that board. The La Follette School is fortunate to benefit from Chuck's thoughtful service and counsel. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Chuck Pruitt.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, I did want to start by taking just a moment to recognize the extraordinary leadership that Susan Yaki has brought to the La Follette School of Public Affairs. As Susan has told you, this school is on a stunning growth trajectory, and it is accomplishing amazing things every day. And it is here in this place in no small part because of her leadership. She is a true visionary and, quite simply, one of the most inspiring higher education leaders I have ever met. So thank you, Susan, for all you have done to get us here, and thank you for all you're going to do in the days and years ahead. We are most appreciative. So the first time most of us heard of Nate Silver was in 2008 during a pretty consequential presidential campaign. Nate had founded a data-driven website called FiveThirtyEight, and he quickly captured the imagination and attention of all kinds of people who are interested in who was going to win and who was going to lose, beginning with who was going to win the Democratic presidential nomination between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, and then later who would win the presidential contest between John McCain and Barack Obama. It was a daily ritual to check on 538 to see where Nate and which way Nate had moved the numbers. I happened to be on kind of the inside of one of those campaigns, and I can testify that on days when the odds improved for your side, you thought Nate was brilliant. When they slumped the following day or the following week, you concluded he was clueless. But in politics, as in sports, you are measured by what the scoreboard says at the end of the competition. And in that case, and by that measure, at the end of the day, Nate had correctly predicted the presidential winner in 49 states in 2008 and secured a place at the front of the line in terms of pundits and respected observers analyzing trends in politics in America. 2 years later, 538 became a licensed feature of the New York Times, and 4 years after that, with new ownership, they broadened their scope to include not just politics, but sports, science, economics, and popular culture. The timing of Nate being here could not be better. The November midterm elections, in case you didn't notice, are just 13 days away. As Susan mentioned, Nate's appearance here is made possible because of support from David and Madeleine Lubar and from former United States Senator Herb Kohl. A hallmark of Senator Kohl's career was a commitment to the search for evidence-based, bipartisan solutions to our country's problems. That is at the core of the mission of the Follette School, and I know it is why Senator Kohl is especially proud to support the work of the Follette School. And it is not without irony that two of the things Herb Kohl loves most, politics and sports, coincide with two of the things Nate Silver knows and is most passionate about. We will wait for a later day and time to hear from Nate as to whether the Milwaukee Bucks will win the NBA championship again this year for their second time in 3 years. Although as I read it, Nate, the current projections give the Bucks a measly 6% chance to win the finals. Getting dangerously close to the clueless category, I fear. But that is for another day. For now, we have a more pressing business. We have consequential midterm elections that will determine the control of the United States Senate, the House, key governor's offices across the country, and quite possibly the future of democracy, all at stake and all on the ballot in 13 days. So, on behalf of the University of Wisconsin-La Follette School of Public Affairs, please join me in welcoming Nate Silver.
Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Despite my Tigers cap, I am in some ways a product of Wisconsin. My parents both went to Wisconsin. I met in graduate school here. My grandpa actually worked for Senator La Follette, so a lot of direct connections here. But I'm happy to be back. I'm so happy that events like this are happening again around the world. It's important, I think, to gather in person. So I want to talk some midterms. We're going to talk first about some of the most important policy questions facing voters this election and what voters care most about. Not my opinion about which policies are most important, although I'll do a little bit of editorializing about democracy, but what issues are driving voter behavior. And then look at the actual forecast up to the minute. We'll bring up the webpage at 5:38. Maybe it will have changed by the time we actually get there, and then do some questions with Susan. I want to start, though, by providing some historical context. I'm going to pull out my phone because we want to be accurate, and I have specific numbers in here. I don't want to just guess. One of the biggest truisms of American politics is that the president's party loses ground at the midterms. And truisms are hard to find in elections. You only have one election every 4 years or 2 years, depending on how you count. The world is always changing, but this has been a very robust trend for a very long time. Since 1934, the opposition party gains an average of 28 House seats and 4 Senate seats. So you might think, given that Democrats have the narrowest possible majorities, that we shouldn't really even have anything to talk about tonight. We could go watch the Bucks game, right? You would assume in an ordinary year, Democrats would lose quite a few seats in both chambers, GOP control. Fast forward to 2024, of course, elections have consequences, so lots of implications for the country. As you'll see, though, the Senate is still quite competitive. The House, maybe not as much, although there are some chances for Democrats. But there are also exceptions. 1934, FDR's Democrats gained seats after the Great Depression. 1998, after the Monica Lewinsky scandal. 2002, after September 11th. 1962 was a partial exception after the Cuban Missile Crisis. JFK's Democrats lost only a few seats in the House and gained a couple of Senate seats. So when you have either cataclysmic events, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, or partisan overreach, like in the Lewinsky crisis, you can have unusual things, but that's not what you would bet on necessarily. So why does this happen? Part of it is what we would call in statistics mean reversion. Think about 2010, right? Between 2006 and 2008, Obama's Democrats had won every imaginable swing district, pretty much. So reversion to the mean had a harsh effect. You go back to a more competitive environment, they lost 63 seats in the House. In this case, Democrats are not starting from such a high bar. I mean, they barely have majorities at all. But still, historically, voters tend to want balance. A party is elected, they do things, those things often initially are unpopular, like Obamacare, even though it became more popular later on. Also, losing tends to motivate more than winning. If you are out of power, you will kind of crawl on glass to go vote. If you're in power, you might become more complacent. Is that true of Democrats this year? I think that's an open question, but that explains some of the historical trend. Also, there's lots of evidence that voters are unhappy about the direction of the country. Biden's approval rating is 42%. 67% of voters say the country is on the wrong track. This is not a good environment to be the incumbent party, which is this case the Democrats. So that's the context that, in some sense, expectations should be fairly low, but there are a couple other things to worry about, or think about, rather. One, individual candidates can matter a lot. In some ways, this year will be a test of whether flawed candidates can outweigh the partisan fundamentals and the kind of gravity, so to speak, of a midterm. If it's an election about issues, that might actually help Democrats so much. People are unhappy about things like inflation, for example. It might be more about, is it a personality contest or a contest of which candidate has the worst scandal in a race like Georgia, for example. Also keep in mind that in the Senate, the bar is pretty high for Democrats to clear because there is a big structural advantage in the Senate toward rural states. Wyoming has as many senators as California and Texas. People take this for granted. It's kind of built into our understanding of the system now, but it has a big effect. Rural voters have about 1.5x the voting power of an average voter in the Senate. That helps to explain why issues like climate change, although there was significant progress this year, or gun control, have been sometimes slow. Issues we have a big urban-rural divide. The rural Senate tends to dominate on energy issues, for example. So what are the four most influential issues this year? I'm actually cheating. It's kind of 4.5 issues. I'm lumping two together. I think you always have to start with issue number one, which is inflation and the economy more generally. 44% of voters name inflation or the economy generally as their top issue. That's from the new New York Times Siena poll. This is no surprise. There is a lot of political science research on economic voting. And sure, you can say Democrats should do more to talk about the lower unemployment rate. Different indicators are going in different directions. Inflation is high in other countries. For the most part, though, voters are not doing a dissertation on which party deserves blame. They are saying, Democrats control the Congress, Democrats control the presidency, Democrats made a lot of decisions in 2021 to stimulate the economy, and therefore Democrats own it. That's a pretty hard set of gravitational characteristics to overcome. Gas prices in particular have tracked the fluctuations in the polls very well this cycle. If you just kind of looked at gas prices, that might tell you more than the polls themselves about kind of where the race was at. There is some abatement in gas prices recently over the past couple of weeks. I also think, by the way, anxiety over inflation may in some sense reflect anxiety over COVID and Biden's promise to return to normalcy. It's weird now how COVID has exited the discussion in a lot of ways. More than a million Americans died. Our lives were disrupted in ways they hadn't been for more than a year, still are in some cases and in some ways. So kind of lingering sense of Biden promised to restore normalcy. It is feeling a little better in some ways, but inflation, the supply chain, maybe a reminder of ways that it's not. Issue number 2, this is the issue that is keeping, I think, the Senate competitive, which is abortion in the Supreme Court. The decision in June, the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade, was deeply unpopular. 57% of voters disapproved, including 43% who strongly disapprove. So it's not just that directionally it moves votes, but also it is an issue people are passionate about. And it reverses that traditional balancing of power in some ways. Like I said before, party comes into power, they sweep and do a bunch of policy changes. In this case, the GOP reminded us of how much power conservatives still have, both from the courts and also from state governments. So that might be a case where people say, hey, power is balanced enough already when you have a 6-3 conservative majority in the Supreme Court. Let's stick more with the status quo. That seems fair enough, potentially. There's pretty clear evidence that Dobbs had some effect. One nerdy measure I like is called the generic congressional ballot. It measures just party preferences for control of Congress. Before Dobbs, the GOP led by 3 points on that measure. Democrats shot up to a 2-point lead after Dobbs. It's now reverted back to more of a tie or a 1-point lead for the GOP, but you had tangible evidence. You had an abortion referendum in Kansas, for example, that lost by 18 points. You had special elections in New York and Alaska where Democrats had a period where they did very well. You have data of higher voter registration, especially among young women for the Democratic Party. So there was tangible evidence that this was mattering a lot in the summer, but it may have faded to some degree in voters' minds now. Now only 5% of voters say it's their top issue, but we should remember there are states like Wisconsin, many states, where this is an active issue. If you're in New York State or something, there's no chance abortion is going to be banned. In Wisconsin and many other states, it could be, and so it's like a material issue to women and their partners, and not just a matter of a battle over kind of social affairs and that kind of thing. Issues 3A and 3B, which I grouped together, are crime and immigration. They tend to come up sometimes more commonly with rank-and-file voters than you'd think. For example, 5% of voters rank immigration as their top issue in that New York Times poll, which is the same as abortion. There are also issues where the GOP tends to have an advantage. I'm sure you have seen many campaign ads here in Wisconsin. The ads from Ron Johnson target Mandela Barnes as being weak on crime. If you were a border state, they target him as being weak on immigration as well. But this does come out in the polling. In a recent Reuters Ipsos poll, GOP has an 8-point advantage on solving immigration and a 9-point advantage on solving crime. Democrats in some ways are still walking back rhetoric, all from the 2020 primary where they were trying to out-liberal one another, from the racial reckoning in 2020 where there were pledges to defund the police. In politics where people can kind of cherry pick the worst thing you said, or the most controversial thing you said, even if it was 2 years ago, that can have lingering effects potentially. There is debate over kind of how much these concerns are real versus imagined, but certainly on immigration, there is data that there are problems at the border. There were 1.7 million encounters with migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border in 2021, which is a record, and we're on track for 2 to 3 million in 2022. The crime data is much more debated. There is pretty clear evidence that crime rose in 2020, or at least homicides rose. There is less clear evidence on what happened since then, as well as what happened to crimes apart from homicide. But of course, perceptions of crime are sometimes as or more important than the reality. To take one example, in 2016, crime had been on a long, fairly steady decline for quite a few years, including over the entire 8-year term of the Obama White House. But 57% of voters in a Pew poll said they thought crime was rising, including many Democrats. Only 15% said crime had declined, which was the correct answer statistically. So that has long been a powerful attack that conservatives tend to use against Democrats and liberals, and it's back this year. Issue number 4 is the category of threats to democracy. And this is the one on which I'm going to editorialize a tiny bit, in part because we're in Wisconsin, which is a state where you've seen this play out to a large degree than it may have in the rest of the country. In particular, where you have a big misalignment between voter preferences and the makeup of the state legislature due to very aggressive and hard to undo perpetual gerrymandering. 60% of Americans will have an election denier on the ballot this fall. That's a stat from FiveThirtyEight. Some of them are going to win. They're going to win certainly in red states, and they may win in some purple states. Kerry Lake in Arizona is in a dead heat in the governor's race there, for example. I think sometimes people spent too much time projecting specific scenarios, right? In 2020, the idea was, well, the Supreme Court will step in and stop the count in Pennsylvania, whatnot, and steal the election that way. That didn't happen. The court was actually quite good on not playing ball with efforts to interfere with the vote count. I just think, we don't need to be that specific. If we have more people in power, including power to officiate elections, who believe the previous election was stolen, then there are a variety of bad things that could happen. I don't know if I want to predict the particular scenario by which that might be bad. And again, I'm someone who is concerned about alarmism. I do think sometimes in the press, if it bleeds, it leads. I think sometimes partisans tend to say, oh, this election's the most important election of our lifetimes. Every issue is in bold headlines. This issue is really important, and even a small likelihood of a constitutional crisis is pretty worrying. Maybe we survive 2024 okay, maybe because one party wins pretty clearly. The issue still rolls over to 2028. If we have a next constitutional crisis the next time we have a close election in the U.S., then that's a big problem sooner or later for our democracy. Do voters care? On the surface, maybe. In the New York Times poll I mentioned earlier, 71% of voters say democracy is in danger. But if you break that finding down, it means different things. Republicans say yes to that question because they believe the election was stolen incorrectly last time. Democrats might be worried about voter suppression. Everyone is concerned about the media. People say the media is contributing to the decline of democracy. So it may not be as focused a concern as you might think it would be based on events like January 6th, for example. At the same time, there is some evidence that election denial is not a popular position. About 2/3 of independent voters do think Biden won legitimately, for example. There are cases like Brian Kemp in Georgia, who officiated the election properly in 2020. He beat David Perdue in the primary and is now in a strong position against Stacey Abrams, the Democrat, even as Raphael Warnock is tied or a point or so ahead of Herschel Walker. So voters are able to split their tickets and say there's a small group of independent voters who do seem to care about this stuff. One of the problems is that in many ways, January 6th, for example, it was a near miss. It was a very frightening near miss where things had gone differently by a matter of minutes or seconds. It could have been a much worse result. But, think about COVID. Think about how the Congress has done nothing, even with that happening, to approve funding for new pandemics, which would produce a huge return on investment. COVID costs so much to our lives and to the economy, and Congress is so stubborn, they won't even approve funding to prevent the next COVID outbreak or the next infectious disease. So it's hard to motivate people to really double down and change their minds unless you actually see a crisis. And, again, I'm not sure if I've been at 50-50 odds, but the odds are increasing that we will need some type of crisis before the situation is resolved. I wish I had a cheerier note to end on, but with that, let's bring up the 538 forecast and do some horse race. Hopefully, there we go. Okay. So this is our forecast as of just moments ago, or actually it was at 4:46 p.m. So we'll start with the Senate. The term dead heat sometimes gets overused, but 54 versus 46 is about as close to a coin flip as you would get, even in poker. If you had a hand where one hand is a 54% chance, you'd say it's a coin flip. That has changed a bit. Democrats were up to, I think, as high as 70% or so in the forecast as of just after Labor Day. There has been momentum in the polls back toward the GOP more recently. We can maybe look at this chart down below here. All right, it's very exciting to see the scroll, all the 5e Fox coverage. So you kind of see, we've kind of come full circle. Back in June, you had Democrats performing pretty well in some individual races, but given the history of the midterms and the strong performance for the opposition party, our model assumed a Republican year. This is kind of right when Dobbs happens, and you see Democrats grow, and then the news cycle begins to shift. Sometimes after Labor Day, voters lock in a little bit more. By the way, in some of these polls, it's not a matter of people changing their minds, it's a matter of undecideds deciding. In the summer, undecideds who were Democrats said, abortion is a threshold issue for me, I'm going to get out and vote Democratic. That left a lot of Republican-leaning undecideds on the sidelines, and they might say now, you know what, another bout of inflation, another bout of higher gas prices, that's enough for me to get off the sidelines and vote Republican. So we kind of have come back to this 50-50 territory right here. Which seats are most important? There's a top tier of 3 races that Wisconsin is not in, sorry. The big 3 are Nevada, where you have an embattled Democratic incumbent, and in contrast to other states, a comparatively normal Republican nominee in the Attorney General, Adam Laxalt, although he has also been on the fringe of being an election denier. You have Georgia, where the one race that Democrats have had some decent news in is Georgia. Raphael Warnock's polls have held up okay, in part because of ever-increasing numbers of revelations or accusations about Herschel Walker and funding abortions and children out of wedlock. You have Pennsylvania, where the momentum has gone the other way. There have not been any polls yet since the debate in Pennsylvania last night, where the Democrat John Fetterman, who had a stroke at the end of the GOP or the Democratic primary, was having trouble being as coherent as you might be otherwise. So if anything, that 60% might be a little bit high in Pennsylvania, given future news events not yet priced into the polls. You then have a next tier of I guess, really 5 races, Wisconsin among them. This had been one of the states in the summer where Democrats were really defying gravity, where Mandela Barnes had a lead in the polls for much of the year, even though you would think Wisconsin's a purple, if anything, red-leaning state in a red-leaning year with an incumbent. Johnson might not be the most spectacular incumbent, but an incumbent nonetheless, relatively unknown challenger. But now that race has gone in the direction that many people expected, where Johnson's a 3-1 favorite in our model. Likewise, North Carolina, Ohio are states that were not thought to be great Democratic targets, but where their polling has held up okay. Those look not impossible for Democrats, but a bit less likely now. The GOP has other pickup opportunities too. Arizona is one of a number of states where they nominated an inexperienced candidate, in this case Blake Masters, but that race has tightened to some degree against the Democrat Mark Kelly. Then you have New Hampshire, Colorado, which are probably more long shots, but we've seen elections in the past where the polls were way off, and those could come into play if you have another polling disaster. We should move on now to the House. Whoops, hopefully it's loading. It's maybe not loading, but I can go from memory if I need to. So in the House, we currently have Republicans as roughly an 80% favorite. I don't know if you play poker. I play poker, so I think everything in terms of poker hands. If you're playing poker and you have pocket aces, the best possible hand, and your opponent has a pair of 5s, the 5s will win about 19% of the time. So that's Democrats' chances in the House, more or less. If you're able to restore to a case where we've had several years recently, so for example, 2020 and 2016, most pointedly, where Republicans beat their polls. If you had a year where Democrats beat their polls, they're not so hopelessly behind. They actually are in somewhat better shape in the House, given redistricting, than they were with the disastrous map they had before the process that occurred. So it's not crazy to think Democrats could take the House, but this kind of last little shift of momentum toward Republicans makes it harder than it might have seemed to begin with. And again, given how narrow that majority is, given the only kind of 3 times since 1936 when you actually had the House, the President's Party gain seats, that becomes more of a long shot. But I would again emphasize, 19% chances happen. It's not that crazy whatsoever. More likely than the Bucks winning the NBA championship, apparently. It may not be a particularly large gain for Republicans. I think our model has them winning something like 20 seats on average. That is a little below the historical average. If it's a very narrow majority, that could have important implications for policy. Who the GOP leader in that case would be wouldn't necessarily be clear if you have the Freedom Caucus, for example. For that matter, a very narrow Democratic majority. I mean, Nancy Pelosi has done a lot of work to keep that caucus together, but that's not always going to be true. So you could wind up on the razor's edge. By the way, one other thing, I think people think that 2020 was an anomaly somehow. If the race is at all close, we're probably not going to know who wins on Tuesday. We might not know on Wednesday or Thursday. You might even have another runoff in Georgia, which would extend things through December potentially. We're going to have to get used to this kind of being the new normal in American elections. Again, if it's directionally clear, if Democrats are sweeping every toss-up or Republicans are, you'll know. If you listen to me on election night, you'll know. Maybe ABC News will be cautious and not call it, right? But you'll know if you're following the smart sites, right? But anywhere in this case where Wisconsin's taking forever to count its votes, Pennsylvania's a state where they count mail votes after regular votes. This is pretty bad, by the way. I mean, again, I don't really want to dignify 2020 claims of election fraud, but it's going to struck a lot of voters as wrong when you have one batch of ballots that are counted at a different time, and they are different than the other batch of ballots. So finding ways for states to standardize vote counting procedures as a way to increase confidence in the vote counting process would, I think, not avoid all of this, but would reduce the risk of some of this. In gubernatorial races, you have some races that were expected to be competitive that are not. Brian Kemp is a pretty heavy favorite in Georgia. Beto O'Rourke probably not going to win in Texas. The Democrat dream of flipping Texas blue will have to wait who knows how many more years. Wisconsin, though, is a state where you have a very close governor's race. It's a dead heat in our terminology. If you had to pick, I think Evers is ever so slightly ahead in our polling average. Can you get split ticket voting here? You can sometimes. You've had elections, Wisconsin, where you elected Scott Walker and Tammy Baldwin on the same ticket. That's kind of an odd couple, I would say. Could you wind up with Evers +2 and Johnson +3? Yeah, sure. If you have a national shift, though, toward one party or another, then that becomes less competitive, potentially. So that's all for horse race, and now we're going to bring Susan up, and we're going to have some questions. So thank you all very much.
Nate, that was great.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I've got some questions. I also have some questions from these wonderful people who sent them in advance. But let's start with the topic that's on everybody's mind right now, and that's Aaron Rodgers and the Green Bay Packers.
Oh, no.
Because I see that FiveThirtyEight just had a recent analysis on why the Pack has started a season at 3-4. So my question is, what's the advice for the Packers? What should the coach be doing, and how can we use data analytics to turn this around?
It's not a great advertisement for microdosing and whatever Aaron Rodgers was claiming he was doing, I guess. Yeah, I think they need a new... the thing about quarterbacks is they tend to fall off a cliff. You saw even Peyton Manning, it happened. Maybe it's even happening to Tom Brady, right? So, divorcing your wife to play one more season, probably not also a great idea.
Probably don't advise it.
Yeah.
So earlier this year, the Follette School launched the results of our first ever policy poll, where we tried to gauge how Wisconsinites are feeling about the most pressing policy issues of our times. And we get a pretty impressive response rate, and we heard from folks from 71 of our 72 counties. So one of the really interesting findings there was that respondents across the board thought that public policy problems at the national level in the United States were just a much bigger problem than here in Wisconsin. So is that nationalization of policy issues, is that something you're observing in your polling, and could that have an effect on the midterms?
That's a pretty consistent finding where people complain about the state of the country, but if you ask them about their personal circumstances, are you happy about your personal life? Those numbers remain pretty good. They dipped a lot during COVID, during the lockdowns that weren't actually really lockdowns, but they dipped a lot during the peak of COVID. But they remain pretty good. People's personal financial situation remains in some ways pretty good. So that's what is weird about it, right? How much are voters material or post-material is kind of one question, right? Look, in some ways, though, I would say these are a lot of big substantive issues that we're debating in this election, right? It's not like the Virginia governor's race where you're debating critical race theory and obscure issues about teaching in schools, right? Like, inflation's important, crime's important, the Supreme Court's important, and of course democracy is important. And so, I know it's a very optimistic seeming framing, but you can understand why voters might feel conflicted.
I get it. Anytime you're talking about how public policy issues might actually impact an election, that's a good thing, right? So you already mentioned earlier today that you play a lot of poker. So what does the game of poker tell us about politics and policymaking in the United States?
So there are a lot of American presidents who have played poker, from Nixon to Truman to Obama. Poker can teach presidents a lot of complex strategy, a lot of negotiation. I don't know if Biden's a poker player actually or not. But game theory is the foundation of poker. Game theory is also important to how the conflict in Ukraine is playing out. All these kind of theoretical constructs about nuclear deterrence are important. I mean, if we didn't have nuclear deterrence, then there might be actual American engagement on the ground in Ukraine, and there are still potential threats. Putin is in an asymmetric situation where he might have different incentives than he might have had with more co-equal powers during the Cold War. So, poker is a game from which you can learn a lot of strategy. It's a game from which you can learn from people, or learn how to read people. I don't know, I think if we taught Americans more poker, maybe we'd be more rational in our political choices.
All right, so if you look back and you think of all those presidents who you named that played poker, who would be the one you don't want to sit across the table from?
I mean, I think Nixon was thought to be quite good, and I guess he's not the best advertisement for poker.
I love it. So one of our audience members, so we have audience members here in person, we have audience members online as well. One of our online audience members asked me to ask you this.
Cool.
For a recent college grad who has an interest in applying his love for statistics to data-driven journalism, what would you recommend as the first steps to contributing to the field?
Start a blog and publish yourself. There's not really any barriers to entry on the internet, right? I mean, how do you alert interesting people about this? But, there are people I follow on Twitter who were just college students that did smart analysis and then founded their own websites. That's what I did, basically, right? I just kind of started doing stuff and emailing people and being like, hey, do you like this? And people were like, eventually, yes, first in baseball, and then founded FiveThirtyEight on my own. So, I don't know. I mean, it's the internet. It's free to publish, so publish.
Love it. Using social media to their advantage. Okay. I have an audience member question here from our group in Madison. So this individual says, recently, political discourse, especially online, seems to react to political scandals or successes with a shrug. This is not going to affect anything. What do you think are some of the political moments, whether they're scandals or October surprises or even legislative successes, that have truly moved the needle in one particular candidate's favor during your time as a statistical analyst?
I mean, you did have Roy Moore lose in Alabama as a Republican, which is hard to do. So if you're literally credibly accused of being a child molester, then that might be enough. No, scandals do matter, but their impact is diminished. So basically, everything that we call candidate quality, how experienced is a candidate, are they an incumbent, How many terms do they have, right? All those things matter, if you want to quantify it, maybe about half as much as it did 20 years ago, and things are more overtaken by partisanship. So, 20 years ago, a candidate like Herschel Walker, it would just be too much for Georgia, and he would come close, or probably lose by 5 points, right? Now it's pretty competitive. Enough people are willing to hold their nose and say, he's a Republican, that's enough for me. On the flip side, Pennsylvania's a weird case because both candidates have quite different issues. But, I think there are people, if Fetterman holds on, maybe some people think that's fine. He's recovering from a stroke. He seems to be on the road to recovery. But also people who say, you know what? I'm not confident about where he's at, but he's a Democrat, and that's going to be a vote to uphold abortion rights, right? So, so it's becoming more of a parliamentary system where the candidates matter less. Although that's one of the big empirical questions this year. How much do these scandals or problematic candidates matter in these key races?
So do you see, you mentioned it's becoming more of a parliamentary style. Do you see a United States, a future of the United States where we have many political parties going forward?
This kind of goes back to Buberger's Law or whatever, where it is thought that it is hard to have multiple parties in the U.S. In some ways, the parties have undergone transformations. Trump kind of performed a transformation from within of the GOP in a coalition that's actually pretty different than the Mitt Romney version of it. It wouldn't be crazy to think that an independent presidential candidate could be influential, right? Ross Perot had moments where he had a big influence on that race. Teddy Roosevelt was a credible candidate. We're going back pretty far in time now, but I think that would be the vehicle, is that you had a charismatic leader as a presidential on a presidential race, or maybe even like a Senate race, and the party builds around her or him. I think it's a little bit hard to do the kind of Andrew Yang thing where you create this amorphous vehicle, right? Also, what would the party look like, right? It might not be purely centrist, which is what the Andrew Yang party is trying to be, right? It might be kind of more like the Five Star Movement in Italy, where it's kind of anti-authoritarian, anti-elite, but borrowing some populism, but not necessarily in a right-wing inflected direction, and finding good government issues on which to campaign. It'd be a fun exercise on which to figure out kind of, where is the real estate that might be most valuable to a new party? But it's probably not right in the center. There aren't that many people who are right in the center. There are people who are divorced from kind of the two-party system and in some multidimensional way.
So you have been publicly skeptical when talking about how the media covers elections. Could you describe how you think the focus on polls impacts the political dialogue and media coverage? In particular, do you see this shift focusing voters away from issues that they want to hear more about?
I think this is kind of like going to McDonald's and telling people to eat their spinach, right? That's not going to work. Maybe you can go to McDonald's and tell them to eat Culver's, right? This is a better, healthier, tastier, locally grown burger. I'm not sure you're going to, or maybe Impossible Meat or something, right? I'm not sure you're going to affect the demand for burgers versus spinach per se, though, necessarily overall. And a lot of people become engaged about politics and then back into policy because they're interested in the horse race, potentially. I don't know. I think a lot of the issue is that, polls are used improperly in some cases. There's lots of evidence that polls that are outliers, if you have 5 polls in a row showing Johnson ahead, and there's a poll tomorrow showing Barnes up 4, which can happen just by statistical chance alone, right? If the next Marquette poll says that, there'll be dozens of stories about that and narratives written about that, even though in the 538 average it might not move things very much necessarily. When issues are polled, how high quality is the poll? On what issues do voters have enough knowledge where their weighing in is important versus those where it's just obscure and maybe very affected by the way the question is asked and by question wording? But I think in a representative democracy that polls are important. Not all states are crazy like California, where we just put 57 ballot referendums up every year and you have direct democracy. It's representative democracy, and for members of Congress to understand voter preferences, whether they choose to abide them or not, is important. Because the alternative is having people like me, elitist New Yorkers, telling Americans what they're supposed to value and what they're supposed to think. And so the reason why newspapers used to, and because newspapers are dying out, local newspapers, so is local polling in a lot of races. But the idea is you want to actually capture the opinion of the person on the street. It's less cliche than going to a diner in Youngstown, Ohio, right? You actually capture everybody in Youngstown, Ohio with equal probability. So that's the pitch for the importance of polls to the news business and to democracy.
It's one of the reasons we did the Follette policy poll, too, is so we could build some of our programming around the issues that people care about, and we'd be able to say, here's the issues they care about. So you have made it clear that you are a forecaster, not a pollster. But polling data is obviously important to your models, alongside fundraising information, voter turnout, other variables. How do your models incorporate stances on policy issues, if at all?
One variable we look at is how much a member of Congress votes with or against his or her party. So historically, senators that are more bipartisan actually do overperform in polls, or overperform, in actual at the ballot box, right? Susan Collins, you might think that she makes everyone unhappy, but Maine reelected her in a year where Biden actually did very well in Maine. Joe Manchin has won reelection in a very, very red now state in West Virginia, knowing how to kind of calibrate that electorate. It would be nice to have more standard ways of discovering candidate issue positions. One problem, we have something called a Biden score, which is how often a candidate has voted with Biden. It was called Trump score previously. This, I think, has been cited in the most campaign commercials of any fiscal innovation, right? Where you'd be Tim Ryan has voted with Biden 98% of the time, 538.com. The problem now in a very parliamentary system, everything is along party lines, right? Democrats either bring an issue to vote and it passes narrowly, or you have a few unanimous votes like on semiconductor stuff, or it's not brought to the floor. And so, finding quantitative ways to articulate candidates' issue positions, if you could say, and have more texture on who was more liberal or conservative on which issues, that would be interesting. But you would need good ways to parse that data.
So Sam here from our Madison audience asks the following question. Over the past several elections, we've seen several results that don't necessarily line up with our priors. For instance, in 2020, Trump's share of the Latino vote was about 8% higher than was expected. How do you think about differentiating the idiosyncratic abnormalities from the new trends?
Yeah, it's hard to know, and that can happen for states, too. In 2008, for example, Obama won North Carolina, and the thought is, now North Carolina is going to be one of these, purple states or blue states, even like Virginia, and it hasn't been that. It's been a state where Democrats often come close, but not quite. I don't know. It's pretty hard to guess. I mean, I think that the fundamental axis that's emerging in American politics is about the educational divide. Do you have a college degree or not? That may be a proxy for class in America in a lot of ways. So it's not surprising that that Hispanics without college degrees have become more Republican than Hispanics with college degrees, right? That used to be not true. It used to be actually kind of well-educated Hispanics were actually more GOP than Democrats, and so that fault line, I think, is going to open up. It might even open up more, although there already is one, of a gender fault line. People don't realize that, what is it now, 60% of people graduate from college are women? That's a very important trend for society that will also reverberate onto politics. It might increase the gender gap still further.
So hard to know there what's driving it, gender or education.
It's hard to, education seems to be the main factor, and of course education can be a proxy itself for other things, but education urbanicity. Do you live in a dense area or a sparsely populated area? Those are the things that have emerged as much more predictive of politics than they were 20 years ago.
So we have time for one more question, and this is from Cindy, from our audience. Not really about 538 politics, she writes, but about Nate's ability to pick all things that are winners.
Oh, no.
So which team is going to win the World Series this year, Nate?
I mean, the Astros are the better team. Also, everyone hates them, so... I mean, our site says I'm not going to contradict 538, but I'll be rooting for the Phillies.
All right. Cindy, it's the Astros. Can you join me in saying thank you to Nate Silver?
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming out tonight. If you want all things La Follette and you want to see this show again, come to our website or our YouTube channel at the La Follette School. Thanks for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was great. Thank you.